Cowboy bought a fierce pup for $25 3 months later. He couldn't believe his eyes. Sometimes, a seemingly worthless find can become a priceless treasure. A 25-cent wager can change everything. In 1887, at a dusty livestock auction in Silver Creek, a world-weary cowboy named Mark did something that drew stares and head shakes from the entire town. While everyone else was bidding on prized horses and cattle, Mark walked over to a wooden crate where a small, aggressive puppy was snapping at anyone who came close. The auctioneer was practically giving the dog away. One wanted a creature that was born to bite. But Mark saw something different. He paid 25 cents, carried the angry pup home, and ignored the laughter and warnings. 3 months later, when outlaws rode into Silver Creek with guns drawn and murder in their eyes, the town would find out what happened. For Mark, who had just turned 45, the decision to buy the dog seemed simple. But nothing had been simple in his life since the fever had taken his wife, Eleanor, 2 winters before. He stood in the dusty yard of the auction house on that sweltering August morning, watching the familiar dance of commerce. Cowboys squinted at prize bulls, ranchers examined horses, and merchants calculated the worth of everything, from chickens to cattle. The air was thick with the scent of hay, leather, and animal musk, mixed with tobacco smoke and the sharp bite of whiskey. Mark kept a worn leather journal tucked in his vest pocket, the same one Eleanor had given him for their 5th wedding anniversary. "For your thoughts," she had said, pressing the smooth leather into his calloused hands. "The ones you're always chewing on, but never speak aloud." He had filled its pages over the years with observations about weather, cattle prices, and brief memories of how the morning light caught in Eleanor's hair. Silver Creek, the town spread out beyond the auction yard, was a place of modest ambitions and sturdy people. 2 main streets crossed at the center, where the general store faced the saloon, and the church kept a respectful distance. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's business, but minded their own, where a handshake still meant something, and a man's word carried weight. Mark had drifted into Silver Creek 6 months earlier, another wandering cowboy with enough savings to rent a small property outside of town from a widow named Henderson. She had sized him up with sharp eyes, noting his quiet demeanor and the wedding ring he still wore, then named a fair price without haggling. "You seem like a man who values peace," she'd said. "I trust you'll keep it that way." The townspeople had accepted him with the cautious warmth reserved for newcomers who minded their own business. The sheriff, a lean man with silver in his hair, had stopped by to introduce himself. "Heard you were Union cavalry," the sheriff had said. "Long time ago," Mark had replied. "Different life." Jake, who ran the Silver Dollar Saloon, had the easy confidence of a man who could read people quickly. He served honest whiskey and kept the gambling fair. When Mark would stop in for a quiet drink, Jake never pushed for conversation. "A man needs company sometimes," Jake would say, "even if it's just the sound of other folks living their lives nearby." The doctor was perhaps the closest thing Mark had to a friend. The physician, nearing 60, had served as a field surgeon during the war and recognized something familiar in Mark's bearing. "Loss changes a man," the doctor had said. "You strike me as the quiet type." "Quiet seems to suit me," Mark had agreed. The auction house buzzed with activity, but Mark was looking for a milk cow or some chickens to make his place feel more like a working ranch and less like a place to simply mark time. Eleanor had always kept chickens. She claimed they were better company than most people. That's when he heard it, a low, constant growling mixed with sharp yips from the back of the lot. People were giving the area a wide berth. His curiosity got the better of him, and he found a wooden crate with a puppy that looked like trouble wrapped in brown and black fur. The animal, no more than 4 months old, snarled with the ferocity of a full-grown guard dog. Its eyes held a wild intensity born of fear, anger, and a determination not to be touched. "What's the story on this one?" Mark asked the auctioneer. "Found him 3 days ago, running wild," the auctioneer replied. "He's not friendly. He snaps at everything. I'm thinking about just letting him go back to the wild." Mark studied the puppy more carefully. Beneath the aggression, he saw intelligence in those dark eyes. The animal was scared, but something more was driving the hostility, a keenness that suggested a calculated defense. "Mind if I try something?" Mark asked. "Be my guest," the auctioneer shrugged, "but I'm not responsible if he takes a chunk out of your hand." Mark knelt beside the crate, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The puppy's growling intensified, but its eyes tracked his hands. This wasn't blind aggression, it was a calculated defense. "Easy there, little fellow," Mark said softly, using the same tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The puppy continued to growl, but underneath the threat, Mark heard exhaustion. This little warrior had been fighting 4 days, and the effort was wearing him down. Mark pulled his journal from his pocket, tore out a blank page, folded it, and slipped it through the crate slats, offering the paper for inspection. The growling quieted as the puppy sniffed the unfamiliar object. "That's Eleanor's journal," Mark murmured. "She always said paper held the best and worst of people. Maybe you can smell that it's held mostly good thoughts." The puppy's ears came forward just a fraction. "How much?" Mark asked. "Mark, I wouldn't ask money for that trouble," the auctioneer said. "If you want him, he's yours." "How much?" Mark repeated. "Well, I suppose if someone's fool enough to take him, I could ask to bits." Mark fished a quarter from his pocket and handed it to the auctioneer. The coin was warm and worn smooth. He had carried it since his wedding day. His lucky piece, Eleanor had called it. "You sure about this?" the auctioneer asked. "This animal's been nothing but tooth and claw." "I'm sure," Mark said, though he wasn't entirely certain why. Something about the puppy's defiant stance reminded him of his own feelings these past 2 years, angry at the world, defensive, and determined not to let anyone see the fear underneath. Getting the puppy from the crate to his wagon was an adventure, but once settled, the ride back was quiet except for the occasional whimper. Mark found himself talking to the animal, sharing thoughts he usually kept locked in his journal. "Don't know what I'm doing either," he admitted. "Been wandering around lost for 2 years now, snapping at anyone who tries to help. Guess maybe we're both tired of being alone." When they reached the ranch, Mark carried the puppy into the barn and placed him in a pen with fresh straw and water. "This is home now," he said. The puppy emerged and explored with suspicious intensity, but ate with obvious hunger when Mark offered a bowl of leftover stew. That evening, Mark sat on his porch, writing by lamplight. "Day 1, he wrote. "Brought home a pup today. Eleanor would have laughed at me, paying for something that bites everyone. But there's something in his eyes that reminds me of looking in the mirror. Maybe we can figure out how to stop fighting the world together." He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Tom had a routine with the puppy now. Approach slowly, speak softly, and offer food without forcing interaction. It was working. The puppy no longer snapped at the sight of his hands, and had even allowed him to refill its water bowl. Mark carried his morning coffee to the barn and sat on a hay bale. The puppy was awake, sitting in a patch of sunlight. "Morning," Mark said quietly. "Sleep well." The puppy's ears twitched forward as Mark opened his journal. A faded blue silk ribbon fluttered out and landed on the straw. His breath caught in his throat. Eleanor's prize ribbon from the county fair 5 years ago. Had forgotten it was pressed between the pages, marking the entry about that perfect day when she won first place for her apple pie. The puppy's ears came fully forward now, sensing a change in Mark's demeanor. It took a cautious step closer, its dark eyes fixed on Mark's face. Mark lifted the ribbon with trembling fingers, and the memory hit him a physical blow. Eleanor standing behind the judging table, her cheeks pink with excitement, her smile bright enough to outshine the sun. "Thomas Mitchell," she'd called out. "Come see what your wife can do with apples and flour and a little bit of love." They had danced that evening, and Eleanor had pinned the ribbon to her dress. Later, walking home, she had tucked the ribbon into his journal. "For remembering," she'd said. "Sometimes the perfect days need to be marked special, so we can find them again when life gets hard." Mark's vision blurred. His chest felt tight. She never got to have children, he whispered to the barn's shadowy interior. She always said she wanted a house full of little ones. I kept thinking we had time, and then the fever came, and all the time in the world wasn't enough. A soft whimper broke through his grief. Mark looked up to find the puppy pressed against the front of his pen, no longer showing any sign of aggression. The small animal was watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human, not wary, but concerned. Without thinking, Mark extended his hand. The puppy sniffed his fingers, then did something extraordinary. It pressed its small head against Mark's palm, offering comfort in the only way it knew how. The gesture broke something loose in Mark's chest. Tears he'd held back for 2 years finally came, falling freely as he knelt beside the pen and let the puppy nuzzle his hand. The ribbon fluttered to the straw, forgotten for the moment, as man and dog found solace in their shared understanding of loss. I don't even know what to call you, Mark managed between shaky breaths. The small animal looked up at him with liquid brown eyes that held depths of intelligence and empathy. Chance, he said suddenly. The name felt right. That's what Eleanor would have called you. She always believed in second chances, in finding good where others saw only trouble. As if in approval, Chance pressed closer to the pen's edge, allowing Mark to stroke his head. You know something about loss, don't you? Mark observed. Probably had someone who cared about you before the world went sideways. That's why you were so angry, not because you're mean, but because you're grieving, too. They sat together in the morning light, two damaged souls who had somehow found each other at the right moment. When Mark finally stood to begin his daily chores, Chance whined softly, as if asking him not to go far. Mark smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. I'll be back, he promised. We've got plenty of time to figure out what comes next. He tucked the blue ribbon back into his journal, making a silent promise to Eleanor's memory. He would give Chance the love and patience she would have offered. He would honor her belief in second chances by proving that broken things could heal. Behind him, Chance sat watching, no longer a feral creature driven by fear, but a dog beginning to remember what it felt like to trust. 2 weeks after the auction, Mark had a new rhythm to his days that revolved entirely around the small dog. Chance had grown noticeably. His legs were longer, and his coat had a healthy sheen. More than that, the aggressive posturing had given way to cautious cooperation. Sit, Mark said for the 100th time, holding a piece of jerky above Chance's head. The dog's rear end touched the ground almost immediately. Good boy, Mark praised, offering the treat. Now stay. This was trickier. Chance remained sitting for 10 seconds before his patience wore thin and he bounded forward. Close enough, Mark said, scratching behind his ears. The training sessions were the highlight of their days. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. In the evenings, Mark had taken to carving. He found a piece of maple wood, perfect for a new project, a training whistle. Training dogs requires clear communication, he explained to Chance one evening. Words are good, but sounds can carry farther. As he worked, Chance watched, his head tilted to one side. The puppy had learned to recognize the evening routine and would settle down with a contented sigh. The whistle was taking form under Mark's patient hands, not fancy, but clean-lined and practical, like the ones he'd carved during his cavalry days. Your hearing's probably better than mine anyway, Mark said, testing the whistle's tone. Dogs hear things we miss, trouble coming long before it arrives. As if to prove his point, Chance's head suddenly came up. His ears pricked forward. A moment later, Mark heard it, 2 hoofbeats approaching at a steady pace. He set down his carving and moved to the barn door. The rider was still 100 yards out, but Mark could see enough to know this wasn't a neighbor. The man sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, and a gun hung low on his hip. Evening, the man called out, looking for work. Nothing that can't wait until morning, Mark replied evenly. Town's got a hotel. Thought maybe you could spare some space in your barn. From inside, Chance's growling intensified slightly, a controlled warning, not the wild snarling of his early days. Barn's full up, Mark said, which wasn't true, but seemed prudent. The stranger's eyes narrowed. "That dog of yours sounds unfriendly." "He's selective about who he likes," Mark replied. "Tends to be a good judge of character." For a moment, the two men regarded each other. The stranger's eyes swept across the yard, and Mark could feel Chance's tension radiating from the barn. The dog's instincts were clearly warning him against this visitor. After a few seconds, the stranger remounted his horse. "Might see you around," he said, the words sounding more like a promise than a casual farewell. Mark watched until the rider disappeared, then returned to the barn where Chance was pacing anxiously. "Good boy," Mark said, kneeling by the pen. "That was excellent judgment. Something about that fellow didn't sit right with me either." Chance pressed against the pen, seeking reassurance. He was still tense, but he calmed under Mark's gentle stroking. "You protected me just now," Mark realized aloud. "Even penned up, you were ready to fight." It was a revelation that stirred something deep inside him. This small dog had already formed a bond strong enough to inspire protective instincts. Chance wasn't just learning commands, he was choosing Mark as his person, worth defending. Mark picked up his half-finished whistle. "Tomorrow we'll start working with this," he promised. "If there are more visitors like tonight's, I want to make sure we can communicate when it matters." Chance settled down with a final watchful look toward the yard, his ears remaining alert for sounds that didn't belong to their peaceful evening routine. A month after the auction, Mark woke to the sound of scratching and snuffling coming from the barn. He had left Chance free to roam the enclosed area the night before, a privilege earned through weeks of good behavior. Mark padded across the yard and found Chance digging industriously at a loose floorboard. "What have you found there, boy?" Mark asked. Chance looked up and wagged his tail before returning to his excavation. Mark knelt beside the dog and worked the board free, knowing exactly what Chance had discovered. The hiding place had been his secret for 6 months, a repository for items he couldn't bear to discard. Inside lay his cavalry saber, wrapped in oiled cloth, his old field glasses, a faded photograph of his unit, and his service medals. Chance sniffed the saber with intense curiosity, his sensitive nose detecting the scent of oil, leather, and old metal. More than that, Mark realized, the dog was reacting to the significance of the objects. "You know what this is, don't you?" Mark said quietly, lifting the saber. The weight felt familiar, awakening muscle memories of drills and desperate moments. The saber was a presentation piece given to him for exceptional courage at the Battle of Shiloh. "I was a scout," Mark explained, sitting cross-legged on the barn floor with Chance pressed against his side. "I rode ahead of the main force, gathered intelligence. Dangerous work, but someone had to do it." The war had changed everything. He had returned to Eleanor thinking he'd left it all behind, but the skills had remained, buried but never forgotten. "Eleanor never minded that part of me," Mark said. She understood that some experiences mark a man permanently. She used to say he slept like a soldier, always listening even in dreams. Chance seemed to approve of the saber's presence, settling down as if claiming guard duty over Mark's military past. That evening, Mark noticed Chance following him toward the house. Instead of heading to his usual spot in the barn, the dog walked directly to the space beside Mark's bed and lay down. The message was clear. His place was wherever Mark was. Mark found himself strangely moved. "All right, then," he said softly. "I suppose there's room for both of us." Chance's tail thumped against the floor, and within minutes, the dog was sleeping peacefully. It was the first time in 2 years Mark hadn't fallen asleep to complete silence. The next morning, Sheriff Hawkins rode up to the house. "Got some news that concerns everyone," he said, taking a cup of coffee. "You heard of the Crimson Gang?" Mark nodded grimly. The gang had been terrorizing communities for a year. "They hit Millerville 2 days ago," Hawkins continued. "Word is they're heading this direction." Chance, who had returned from his morning patrol, sat alertly beside Mark's chair, sensing the gravity of the conversation. "You think they'll hit Silver Creek?" Mark asked. "Hard to say," Hawkins replied, "but I'm warning everyone to be extra careful." Mark told him about the suspicious rider from the week before. "Fits the pattern," the sheriff said. Good thing you turned him away." As Hawkins prepared to leave, he looked at Chance. "That's quite a dog you've got there. Looks like he'd fight for you." "I believe he would," Mark said quietly. "Question is whether we'll need him too." 6 weeks after the auction, Mark was checking the fence line when he caught himself mid-sentence, explaining his plans for expanding the herd to Chance. This was exactly how he used to talk to Eleanor during their evening walks. Chance looked up at him, and Mark realized the dog was a good listener, just as Eleanor had been. He felt a wave of gratitude that this loyal animal had filled a void, giving him a companion for both work and worrying. Mark pulled the carved whistle from his pocket. Chance's ears immediately perked up. The dog had learned to associate the whistle with commands and understood the subtle variations in Mark's signals. A soft, low whistle sent him to a fallen log. A higher note sent him over it. 3 quick staccato notes brought him racing back. "You got those signals down better than some cavalry horses I've known," Mark praised. Their training was interrupted by Doc Peterson's wagon. "You're looking better than I've seen you since you came to Silver Creek," the doctor said. "Jake mentioned you actually laughed at one of his stories last week." Mark hadn't realized the change was so visible. "Dog's been good for me," he admitted. "Gives me something to focus on besides myself." "Dogs have a way of doing that," Doc agreed. "They live so completely in the present that they pull us along with them." Doc's tone became more serious. "Been hearing more stories about that gang. They hit Copper Falls yesterday, about 60 miles north. 3 dead." He said they were getting bolder. "What's Hawkins planning to do?" Mark asked. "Not much he can do," Doc replied. "He's hoping they'll pass us by." Mark touched his wedding ring. "Hope's a thin strategy," he observed. "True enough. But what else can we do? We're just ordinary folks." "Maybe ordinary folks can be more than they appear," Mark said quietly. "Sometimes peaceful folks have to make hard choices." 2 months after the auction, Mark found himself looking at his reflection in Eleanor's mirror. The hollow-eyed, grief-stricken man who had arrived in Silver Creek had been replaced by someone who stood straighter and moved with purpose. "I hardly recognize myself," Mark murmured to Chance, who was lying on the rug. The dog had grown substantially, his gangly puppy proportions giving way to a powerful build. He had learned to open gate latches, bring specific tools, and alert Mark to anything unusual. "I look like a man who has reasons to get up in the morning," Mark realized. Chance padded over and rested his head on Mark's knee. Their evening ritual. "Eleanor would have loved you," Mark said, stroking his ears. "She had a gift for seeing potential in things others overlooked." The memory brought warmth instead of pain. "She'd say that running from trouble just means it catches up with you when you're too tired to fight. Better to face it on your own terms." A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Chance was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Mark and the potential threat. "Mark, it's Sheriff Hawkins," a voice called out. Mark opened the door to find the sheriff looking grim. With him were Jake from the saloon and other men from town. "We need to talk," Hawkins said. "We need to talk about what we're going to do when the Crimson Gang decides to pay Silver Creek a visit." "They hit Riverside yesterday," Jake announced. "That's 4 towns in 6 weeks. We're right in their path." The sheriff said he was calling a town meeting for the next night. "Whether we're going to run, hide, or stand and fight," Hawkins said bluntly. "Because those are our only options." One of the men, Peterson, spoke up nervously. "Most of us aren't fighters. What chance would we have?" Mark found himself looking at his reflection in the cracked mirror, seeing himself fractured but still recognizable. The man in that mirror had capabilities others didn't know about. "Sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things," Mark said quietly. "Question is whether we're willing to accept that responsibility." Sheriff Hawkins studied his face. Doc Peterson mentioned, "You might have some military experience." Mark was quiet for a long moment, aware that his answer would change everything. "I have experience," he admitted finally. "And if the town decides to make a stand, I'll help organize our defense. But understand, once we commit to fighting, there's no going back. These men won't show mercy." The room fell silent. "We'll put it to the town tomorrow night," Hawkins said. Let everyone have their say. As the men prepared to leave, Jake turned back to Mark. Just so you know, if we do decide to fight, most folks will look to you for leadership. After they had gone, Mark sat alone with Chance, listening to the familiar sounds of the night. The dog moved closer, resting his head on Mark's foot in a gesture of solidarity. Looks like our quiet life might be coming to an end, Mark said softly. You ready for whatever comes next? Chance looked up at him with unwavering loyalty. Mark knew he had found more than just a companion. In that auction crate, he had found a partner. 3 months after the auction, Mark was cleaning out an old trunk when he found something he'd forgotten. A sepia-toned photograph of 12 men in Union cavalry uniforms. He held it up to the lamplight, studying faces he hadn't seen in over 20 years. There was Lieutenant Morrison, who died at Gettysburg, and Sergeant Walsh, who taught Mark half of what he knew about reading terrain. And there, third from the left, was Mark himself, younger and leaner. Chance, who had been dozing, suddenly came alert. He moved closer to the photograph, his nostrils flaring. He wasn't just smelling it, he was staring at the image itself, his head tilted in concentration. You see something, boy? Mark asked. Chance whined quietly. A sound Mark had learned meant he was trying to communicate something important. Mark studied the picture again. The men of Company B, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, Special Reconnaissance Unit. We called ourselves the Ghosts, Mark said, settling on the floor so Chance could see. We'd slip through enemy lines, map their positions, and stay invisible for weeks. Chance listened intently, as if recognizing something familiar in the military context. I was a scout, Mark explained. I had a gift for reading country. Colonel Brooks used to say, I thought like a battlefield. He traced the faces of his dead comrades. We lost 8 men over 3 years. Good men who trusted me to lead them. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Chance made a soft, sigh-like sound and rested his head on Mark's knee, his eyes fixed on the photograph, as if memorizing the faces. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Hawkins stood on the porch, holding an official-looking document. Mark, he said gravely, we need to talk. Hawkins came inside and sat down, remaining tense. I sent some telegrams after our meeting last night. I asked about your military service, thinking it might help us understand what we're dealing with. Hawkins unfolded the document. According to the War Department, Thomas Mitchell of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry was awarded the Medal of Honor for single-handedly infiltrating General Hood's headquarters and stealing battle plans that prevented a surprise attack on Nashville. It also lists the Silver Stars and the Distinguished Service Cross. The room fell silent. Why didn't you tell us? Hawkins asked. Because that man died when the war ended, Mark replied quietly. I came home planning to be nothing more than a rancher and husband. Mark, do you understand what this means? Hawkins said. You're one of the most decorated reconnaissance officers in the Union Army. The telegram says you personally conducted over 40 missions with an unprecedented success rate. Chance moved closer, pressing against his leg in support. The war's been over for 20 years, Mark said. Those skills don't necessarily translate, don't they? Hawkins challenged gently. Reading terrain, predicting enemy movements, planning defensive strategies. Seems to me those abilities are exactly what we need. Before Mark could respond, there was an urgent knock. It was young Beely Henderson, the widow's grandson, out of breath. Sheriff Hawkins, he gasped. My ma sent me. There's men in town asking questions about Silver Creek. They're in the saloon, acting friendly, but ma says they've got the look of trouble. How many? Hawkins asked. 3 that I saw. Did they ask about anyone specific? Mark asked carefully. Beely nodded. One of them asked Jake, as there were any ex-soldiers living around here. Mark and Hawkins exchanged glances. This was more than scouting. This was targeted intelligence gathering. Mark asked Beely for more details. They rode good horses, and their guns weren't just for show. My ma said they reminded her of soldiers, but not the good kind. Chance had been listening with growing alertness. Now he moved to the window, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Someone's out there, Mark said quietly. his old military instincts fully engaged. Chance can sense them. Hawkins drew his gun. How many? Mark studied Chance's behavior. At least 2, maybe more. Far enough away that they think they're hidden, but close enough to watch the house. The Crimson Gang, Billy whispered. Probably scouts, Mark replied, the familiar calm descending over him. They want to know who they're dealing with. Chance moved away from the window and positioned himself near the door, ready for action. What do we do? Hawkins asked. Mark looked at the photograph and then at Chance. We let them watch, Mark said finally. Let them think they're being clever, while we prepare for what's coming. After tonight, there's no pretending this is just a possibility. The Crimson Gang isn't just heading towards Silver Creek, they're specifically targeting us. Why? Billy asked. We're not rich. Mark met Hawkins's eyes. They've heard about the ex-soldier living here. They want to know if I'm a threat, and after tonight, they'll know the answer. Dawn broke cold and clear. Mark had been awake since before first light, watching the horizon through his military field glasses he'd retrieved from his cache. Through the lenses, he could see 4 miles. Chance sat alertly beside him, mirroring his tension. There, Mark said quietly. 6 riders, about 3 miles out. They're moving with the purposeful coordination of a military unit. Chance's ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Easy, boy, Mark murmured. We've got work to do. The previous evening, the town meeting had been brief but decisive. The people of Silver Creek had chosen to stand and fight, and had unanimously agreed to follow Mark's leadership. Now, as the moment of confrontation approached, Mark felt the familiar weight of command settling over him. He pulled out his carved whistle and gave a series of complex signals. Chance responded immediately, moving through a sequence of actions with the precision of a well-trained soldier, retrieving rope and performing a series of actions at the water trough that were part of a communication system Mark had developed. Over the past week, Mark had quietly transformed the town into a defensive position that would have impressed his old commanders. He'd identified key positions, created overlapping fields of fire, and convinced the townsfolk to dig concealed trenches. Sheriff Hawkins arrived with a small group of men, including Doc Peterson and Jake Morrison. They're coming, Mark reported. Maybe an hour out. Mark pulled out the map he'd drawn. Jake, you take Peterson and Williams to the general store. Doc, you're in the bank. Sheriff, you and I will coordinate from the saloon. Doc asked about communication. Mark held up his whistle. Chance and I will maintain communication between positions. He's learned to carry messages and signal locations. The men were skeptical until Mark demonstrated. A series of signals sent Chance racing across the yard to a predetermined position, where he clearly conveyed information. As they prepared to move, Hawkins asked, "Are you certain about this? We can still evacuate." Mark considered it. They were farmers and shopkeepers facing experienced killers, but he thought about the suspicious scout, about Beely's report, and the gang's pattern of destruction. They're not going to let us run, Sheriff, Mark said finally. They've invested too much time, and they know about my background now. To them, I represent a threat that needs to be eliminated. Chance pressed against his leg, a source of strength. Besides, Mark added, Eleanor always said some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. These people trusted me enough to stay. I won't abandon them. Hawkins nodded grimly. Then we'd better get into position. The Crimson Gang rode into town at 12 minutes past noon. Mark watched from the roof of the general store, with Chance crouched silently beside him. Through his field glasses, Mark saw the leader, Crimson Jack, a tall, lean man with a red bandana and cold eyes. Nobody in sight. One of the men called out, "Looks like they got word and ran." "Maybe," Jack said, "but he've learned not to trust empty streets." He sent 2 men, Rodriguez and Martinez, to check the saloon and general store. Tom brought the whistle to his lips and gave a barely audible signal. Enemy scouts approaching. Prepare for engagement. From his position, he could see Sheriff Hawkins nod in acknowledgement. Rodriguez pushed through the saloon doors. Martinez was growing suspicious at the general store. "Something's not right here," Martinez shouted. "This place is too neat." Crimson Jack's expression hardened. "Everyone out," he commanded. "You've got 60 seconds to open that bank. After that, we start burning buildings." The threat hung in the air. Mark had learned that sometimes the only way to prevent greater violence was to meet aggression with decisive force. He brought the whistle to his lips and gave the signal they had all been waiting for. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sheriff Hawkins stepped into view from behind the jail. Doc Peterson appeared at an upstairs window of the bank, and Jake Morrison emerged from the saloon. The dog had created the most chaos. At Mark's whistle command, Chance launched himself from the rooftop of a spectacular leap, landing behind the gang's horses. He was trained to spook horses, and he immediately began darting between the animals, barking and nipping at their heels. 3 of the 6 gang members were instantly fighting to control their mounts. "It's a trap," Martinez shouted. Crimson Jack, however, remained calm. He fired a quick shot at Chance, who dodged with fluid grace, then spun to assess the situation. "Spread out. Find cover. Someone kill that dog." But Mark had anticipated this. His whistle signals continued, directing Chance to harass the horses while coordinating the townspeople's defensive crossfire. The first exchange of gunfire shattered the morning's peace. The outlaws were trapped in a carefully designed killing ground, fighting determined people led by a man who understood battlefield tactics better than most professional soldiers. Crimson Jack's cold eyes found Mark's position on the rooftop. "The famous ghost finally shows himself," Jack called out, his voice a mix of respect and deadly promise. Before responding, Mark quickly untied Eleanor's faded blue ribbon from his jacket and secured it around Chance's collar. The silk fluttered briefly in the wind. "For luck," Mark whispered to the dog. The gunfight exploded into full chaos. Mark's military training took over completely. His mind automatically calculated every angle, reload, and tactical opportunity. He could see the entire battlefield from his elevated position. A sharp whistle signal sent Chance to the back of the building, where an outlaw was trying to flank the defenders. Chance intercepted the man, forcing him to retreat. Below, the battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Jake Morrison proved to be an excellent shot, and the outlaws began to escalate their threats. That's when Mark saw Rodriguez making a move on Doc Peterson's position. The elderly physician was focused on Martinez and hadn't noticed the threat. Mark's whistle cut through the gunfire, a sharp, urgent series of notes that sent Chance leaping from the rooftop with breathtaking courage. The dog landed hard and came up running. Rodriguez had his gun raised when Chance hit him from behind like a thunderbolt. The outlaw's shot went wide, and Chance drove him to the ground, positioning himself between the man and his weapon. "Good boy," Mark called out, pride swelling in his chest. But the victory was short-lived. Crimson Jack had used the distraction to work his way closer to Mark's position. "Come down from there, Ghost," Jack commanded. "Time we settled this properly." Jack stood in the narrow alley, his gun trained on Mark's only escape route. "Your dog's impressive," Jack continued, "but dogs can be killed just like men. Come down peaceful, and maybe I'll let him live." Mark was calculating his options when he heard a soft whistle from below Chance's way of indicating he was in position for a coordinated attack. The dog had worked his way behind Jack, Eleanor's ribbon fluttering from his collar. It was a moment that required perfect timing and absolute trust. "You're right about the dog," Mark called down, "but you made one mistake." "What's that?" Jack asked. "You assumed I was fighting alone." Mark's whistle signal was sharp and final, the cavalry command for charge. Chance exploded from the shadows, hitting Jack from behind just as Mark dropped from the roof with his rifle ready. The gang leader was caught between 2 perfectly coordinated opponents. Mark's rifle barrel pressed against Jack's chest, while Chance's teeth were inches from his throat. "Drop it," Mark said quietly, and Jack's pistol fell to the dust. The silence was broken only by the sound of surrender. Their leader's capture had broken the gang's resistance as effectively as any military victory. Mark looked down at Chance, whose eyes held satisfaction and absolute loyalty. Eleanor's ribbon caught the afternoon light, a gentle reminder that some battles are worth fighting, and that courage comes in many forms. In the aftermath, a strange quiet settled over Silver Creek. Miraculously, none of the townspeople had been seriously injured. Mark moved with methodical efficiency, helping secure the prisoners and organize the cleanup. But it was Chance who drew the most attention. The dog guarded the captured gang members, yet greeted everyone who approached with a gentle demeanor. "Never seen anything like it," Jake Morrison said, offering Chance a piece of jerky. "One minute he's fighting like a wild animal, the next he's gentle as a lamb." Mrs. Henderson, the widow who owned Mark's ranch, approached him. "Thomas Mitchell," she said in a no-nonsense tone, "your rent arrangement has changed." Mark's stomach tightened. "You don't pay rent anymore," she said firmly. "What you and that remarkable dog did means you've earned your place here permanently. That land is yours now." Similar conversations followed throughout the afternoon. The general store owner insisted his credit was good for life. Peterson offered free medical services. Jake Morrison declared his first drink would always be on the house. More than the material offers, it was the change in how people looked at him that affected Mark most. The polite distance had been replaced by genuine warmth and acceptance. He was no longer a stranger, but a neighbor. As the sun set, Mark walked home with Chance trotting beside him. The ranch felt different, more like a permanent home. Over the following weeks, Mark settled into a new routine that involved more interaction with the community. Sheriff Hawkins regularly consulted him, local ranchers sought his advice, and even the school teacher asked him to speak to the older children. Through it all, Chance remained his constant companion. 6 months after the confrontation, Mark visited the leather worker and commissioned a special collar for Chance, rich brown leather with silver fittings and a nameplate that read Chance Mitchell. "Now it's official," Mark said softly, admiring it. "You're not just my dog, you're my partner and my family." The next day, Mark took Chance to Eleanor's grave. It was the first time he'd visited since arriving. Standing there with Chance beside him, Mark found he could speak to her memory without the crushing weight of grief. "I want you to meet Chance," he said quietly. "He's the one who taught me that broken things can heal." Mark told Eleanor about their adventures, the battle with the gang, and how their partnership had helped him find purpose again. "I'm not just surviving anymore," he said. "I'm living again." As they prepared to leave, Mark noticed Chance had placed a small wildflower at the base of Eleanor's headstone. Not trained behavior, but a spontaneous tribute from a dog who understood how important this woman had been to his master. That evening, Mark sat on his porch with his journal. Chance lay beside him, watching the sunset. 3 months and 25 cents, Mark wrote. "That's what it cost to buy a second chance at life." He paused, looking at Chance. Eleanor was right, as usual. Sometimes the most precious treasures come disguised as problems nobody else wants. Sometimes a quarter spent in faith returns dividends beyond measure. Mark closed the journal and leaned back, listening to the familiar sounds of evening settling over Silver Creek. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace, knowing he had found not just a home, but a purpose and a partnership worth cherishing.